In the early hours of June 6, 1944, while Allied soldiers were already crossing the English Channel toward the coast of Normandy, Dwight D. Eisenhower carried something far more dangerous than any military order. Folded in his pocket was a short, handwritten statement meant for a world in which D-Day had failed. It was not a speech of defiance or reassurance. It was a message of defeat. If the invasion collapsed on the beaches, Eisenhower was prepared to announce that the landings had failed and to accept full responsibility himself. At a moment when history remembers confidence, resolve, and inevitability, the Allied Supreme Commander was preparing for catastrophe. This document, later known as the Eisenhower D-Day Speech, was written in the quiet hours before the invasion, when uncertainty outweighed hope and the outcome of the war in Europe still hung on a single tide, a single weather window, and a single morning. The existence of this speech reveals how close the Allies believed they were to disaster, and how fragile victory truly felt on the eve of D-Day. The public image of D-Day often suggests careful planning leading to near-certain success. In reality, Operation Overlord was one of the greatest gambles in military history. Weather forecasts were unreliable, intelligence on German defenses was incomplete, and the logistical challenge of landing and sustaining hundreds of thousands of men across open beaches had never been attempted before. Eisenhower knew this better than anyone. As Supreme Commander, he had signed the final order launching the invasion, fully aware that if it failed, there would be no second chance for months, possibly longer. German forces could regroup, reinforce the coast, and crush any future landing attempt. A failed invasion would not only cost tens of thousands of lives, but could prolong the war indefinitely and shatter Allied unity. In that context, Eisenhower's decision to prepare a statement for failure was not pessimism. It was leadership under extreme pressure. He understood that history would demand accountability, and he chose to place that burden on himself before anyone else could deflect it. The speech itself was striking in its simplicity. Eisenhower did not blame weather, intelligence, or the courage of the troops. He praised the effort of Allied forces and then stated plainly that if the landings had failed, the fault was his alone. No qualifiers, no shared responsibility. In an era dominated by powerful personalities and fragile alliances, this was extraordinary. Many senior commanders privately feared failure, but few were willing to publicly accept blame in advance. Eisenhower's position required him to balance not only military command, but political trust between nations, leaders, and populations exhausted by years of war. A disastrous D-Day would have required an immediate explanation to the world. By writing the speech beforehand, Eisenhower removed hesitation from that moment. He had already decided how history would be told if everything went wrong. What makes the Eisenhower D-Day speech so powerful is not that it was delivered, but that it never had to be. While soldiers fought their way ashore at Omaha, Utah, Gold, Juno, and Sword Beaches, Eisenhower waited, listening to reports that ranged from grim to cautiously hopeful. For hours, the outcome remained unclear. At Omaha Beach in particular, casualties were so severe that some feared total collapse. During that window of uncertainty, the speech remained in Eisenhower's pocket, a silent acknowledgement of how narrow the margin between victory and defeat truly was. The world would eventually remember D-Day as the beginning of the end for Nazi Germany. But in those early hours, Eisenhower was prepared to tell a very different story, one of failure, responsibility, and a war that would continue at an even greater cost. The decision to write a statement for failure was shaped by the immense uncertainty that surrounded Operation Overlord in the days leading up to June 6th. Allied planners had debated postponement until the very last moment. Weather over the Channel was unpredictable, seas were rough, and cloud cover threatened to ground air support. A delay of even 24 hours could unravel the entire operation, exposing the invasion fleet to German detection and allowing coastal defenses to strengthen further. Eisenhower was forced to choose between launching under imperfect conditions or postponing and risking complete strategic collapse. When he finally gave the order to proceed, he did so knowing that the margin for error was almost non-existent. The speech he carried reflected that reality, It was not written in comfort or confidence, but in recognition that the invasion could fail for reasons beyond anyone's control. Behind the scenes, Allied commanders were deeply divided over the risks. Some believed the landings could succeed only if everything worked perfectly. Others feared that German defenses, especially at Omaha Beach, would prove overwhelming. Intelligence reports were contradictory. Aerial reconnaissance could not fully assess obstacles hidden beneath the waterline. German troop strength along the coast was underestimated in some sectors and overestimated in others. Eisenhower absorbed these uncertainties without the luxury of deferring responsibility. Unlike battlefield commanders who could react to events as they unfolded, he was committing entire nations to a single irreversible decision. Writing a speech for defeat was his way of confronting that responsibility directly. If the invasion failed, there would be no confusion about who had authorized it. The burden would rest entirely on him. The wording of the speech revealed a deliberate rejection of excuses. Eisenhower specifically avoided language that might shift blame onto subordinates or circumstances. He emphasized that the troops had fought with courage and that the responsibility for the outcome was his alone. This choice was extraordinary in a war where failure often led to finger-pointing and political fallout. The statement was handwritten, brief, and unpolished, reflecting urgency rather than performance. It was intended to be read quickly, under pressure, to a world demanding answers. Eisenhower understood that in the aftermath of disaster, tone mattered as much as content. A speech filled with justifications would undermine trust. A speech that accepted blame could preserve it. What makes this moment especially striking is that Eisenhower did not share the existence of the speech with most of his senior commanders. The burden was personal. While others focused on their specific sectors, Eisenhower carried the psychological weight of the entire operation. He spent the early hours of June 6th monitoring fragmentary reports, knowing that the first messages would be incomplete and often misleading. Some beaches appeared to be succeeding. Others reported chaos and heavy casualties. At Omaha, early news was so grim that serious consideration was given to abandoning the landing entirely. During those tense hours, the speech remained relevant. Failure was not a theoretical possibility. It was an active concern. The fact that the invasion ultimately succeeded does not diminish the significance of the speech. Instead, it highlights how uncertain the outcome truly was. History often compresses complex events into narratives of inevitability, but the reality of D-Day was defined by doubt. Eisenhower's preparedness to publicly acknowledge defeat shows a form of leadership rarely captured in wartime mythology. It was not confidence that drove him, but responsibility. The speech stands as evidence that the Allied victory was not assumed in advance. It was earned under conditions where failure was fully expected, planned for, and accepted as a real possibility. The existence of the Eisenhower D-Day speech only became widely known years after the war, and when it did, it fundamentally altered how historians understood the psychological burden of command on June 6, 1944. The note was discovered among Eisenhower's personal papers, undated at the time and written in plain, direct language. Its most striking feature was not what it said, but what it refused to say. There was no reference to weather miscalculations, no mention of faulty intelligence, no suggestion that Allied troops had failed in their mission. Instead, Eisenhower placed responsibility entirely on himself. In doing so, he rejected one of the most common instincts in wartime leadership, to protect reputation by dispersing blame. This was especially significant given the political environment of 1944. A failed invasion would have triggered intense scrutiny in Washington and London, potentially destabilizing Allied cooperation and undermining public confidence. Eisenhower understood that the way failure was framed would shape not only military consequences, but the political future of the war. By preparing a statement that accepted full responsibility, he aimed to contain the damage before it could spiral into recrimination. This approach reflected Eisenhower's broader philosophy of command. Unlike battlefield generals who thrived on decisive action and personal dominance, Eisenhower's strength lay in absorbing pressure without deflecting it downward. As supreme commander, he sat at the intersection of military strategy and political reality. British and American leaders watched his decisions closely, each with their own priorities and sensitivities. A disastrous D-Day would have intensified existing tensions, particularly between those who favored different strategic approaches earlier in the war. Eisenhower's willingness to accept blame was not an emotional gesture, but a calculated act to preserve unity under the worst possible circumstances. If failure came, the Allies would need cohesion more than explanations. His speech was designed to provide that cohesion by eliminating internal arguments before they could begin. In this sense, the document was as much about alliance management as it was about personal responsibility. What makes the Eisenhower D-Day speech even more remarkable is how narrowly it was avoided. For much of June 6th, success was far from assured. At Omaha Beach, American units were pinned down with catastrophic casualties, and senior commanders seriously considered evacuating the beachhead. Communications were fragmented, and reports reaching headquarters were often contradictory or delayed. Eisenhower did not have the benefit of hindsight. He had to assess the invasion in real time, based on incomplete information and worst-case assumptions. During these hours, the speech remained a viable necessity rather than a historical curiosity. Only later, as footholds were secured and reinforcements landed, did the balance slowly tilt toward success. Even then, the outcome of the wider campaign remained uncertain. The invasion had not failed, but it had not yet succeeded in the way planners had hoped. The fact that Eisenhower never delivered the speech does not diminish its importance. On the contrary, it underscores how leadership at the highest level often operates invisibly. The most consequential decisions are sometimes the ones prepared for but never enacted. The Eisenhower D-Day speech reveals a commander who understood that authority is inseparable from accountability, especially when the stakes involve entire nations and millions of lives. It challenges the simplified image of wartime leadership as unwavering confidence and certainty. Instead, it shows a leader who confronted doubt head-on and planned for disaster without allowing that fear to paralyze action. D-Day succeeded not because failure was impossible, but because it was fully acknowledged and accepted as a risk. The speech stands as a quiet testament to the reality that victory in modern war is rarely the product of certainty. It is the result of decisions made in the shadow of possible defeat. In the years following the war, the Eisenhower D-Day speech came to symbolize a form of leadership that was largely absent from popular memory of World War II. Public narratives favored bold commanders, stirring speeches, and decisive victories. Eisenhower's unpublished statement fit none of those categories. It was brief, unsentimental, and written for an outcome everyone hoped would never occur. Yet historians gradually recognized that this document revealed more about the nature of Allied leadership than any victory address could. It showed that Eisenhower understood the invasion not as a moment for heroics, but as a moral and political gamble whose consequences he was prepared to own. By writing the speech in advance, he removed ambiguity from the aftermath of failure. There would be no scrambling for explanations, no attempt to shield reputations, no effort to reframe disaster as misfortune. Responsibility would be clear, immediate, and personal. In a coalition where blame could easily fracture trust between nations, this clarity mattered. It offered a stabilizing narrative at the precise moment when unity would have been most fragile. This mindset also explains why Eisenhower was chosen as supreme commander in the first place. Unlike more aggressive or charismatic generals, he was trusted precisely because he did not seek personal glory. His authority came from restraint, patience, and an ability to subordinate ego to outcome. The D-Day speech reflected that character. Eisenhower understood that leadership at the highest level was not about being right, but about being accountable when things went wrong. This principle guided his conduct throughout the war, from managing rival commanders to absorbing political pressure from Washington and London. The speech was not an isolated gesture, but a distillation of how he viewed command itself. It acknowledged that no amount of planning could eliminate uncertainty, and that true authority meant standing at the point where uncertainty and responsibility intersected. Today, the Eisenhower D-Day speech is often cited as evidence of extraordinary humility, but its deeper significance lies in what it tells us about decision-making under extreme risk. Eisenhower did not write the speech because he expected failure. He wrote it because he understood that success was not guaranteed and that pretending otherwise would be dishonest. This acceptance of risk did not weaken his resolve. It strengthened it. By confronting the possibility of defeat directly, Eisenhower was able to act decisively without illusion. The invasion went forward, not because leaders believed it could not fail, but because they accepted the consequences if it did. That distinction matters. It separates confidence from denial, courage from recklessness. In the end, the speech's power comes from its silence. It was never read to the world, never broadcast, never needed. Yet its existence reveals how narrow the margin of history truly was on June 6, 1944. D-Day is remembered as the beginning of the end of Nazi Germany, but it began as a moment of profound doubt. Eisenhower stood at the center of that doubt, prepared to bear its cost alone. The Eisenhower D-Day speech that prepared the world for defeat reminds us that victory is not born from certainty, but from leaders willing to accept responsibility for failure before it ever occurs. The Eisenhower D-Day speech also forces a reassessment of how success and failure are remembered in war. History tends to reward visible outcomes, not invisible preparations. The beaches were taken, the lodgment held, and the Allied advance into France followed. In that narrative, contingency disappears. Yet Eisenhower's handwritten statement proves that, on the eve of the invasion, success was anything but assured. What mattered most was not that the Allies believed they would win, but that they accepted they might not. This distinction shaped how decisions were made at every level of command. The invasion went forward not because leaders were certain, but because they judged the risk unavoidable. Eisenhower's speech captured that moment of realism. It acknowledged that even the best prepared operation could collapse under forces beyond control. By preparing for defeat, Eisenhower removed denial from the equation. That clarity allowed action without illusion. This perspective helps explain why D-Day did not unravel when things went wrong. At Omaha Beach, units were pinned down, officers were killed, and entire plans dissolved within minutes of landing. Yet no single failure triggered panic at the top. Eisenhower had already confronted the worst-case scenario mentally. Because of that, reports of disaster did not immediately translate into strategic retreat. He waited, gathered information, and allowed local commanders to adapt. The speech was not a sign of doubt. It was evidence of preparedness. Leaders who imagine only success are often the least capable of managing chaos when it arrives. Eisenhower had already accepted responsibility for failure, which paradoxically gave him the calm required to persevere through uncertainty. The document also highlights a contrast with other wartime leaders. Many commanders cultivated confidence through public certainty, projecting inevitability even when privately unsure. Eisenhower chose a different path. His leadership was not performative. It was functional. The speech was never meant to inspire troops or reassure civilians. It was meant to preserve institutional trust if everything collapsed. That distinction matters. It reveals a commander who understood that credibility, once lost, is nearly impossible to restore. By accepting blame in advance, Eisenhower ensured that if defeat came, it would not be compounded by evasion or denial. In a coalition war where political cohesion was as critical as military success, that foresight was invaluable. Over time, the Eisenhower D-Day speech has come to represent a broader lesson about leadership under extreme risk. It challenges the idea that effective leaders must project unwavering confidence at all times. Instead, it suggests that confronting uncertainty honestly is a source of strength, not weakness. Eisenhower did not diminish his authority by preparing for defeat. He reinforced it. His willingness to shoulder responsibility insulated the alliance from internal collapse and allowed subordinates to focus on execution rather than blame. The fact that the speech was never used does not reduce its importance. It demonstrates that some of the most decisive acts of leadership occur before events unfold, not after outcomes are known. As D-Day receded into history and victory became inevitable, the speech remained tucked away, unseen and uncelebrated. Yet its quiet existence offers one of the clearest windows into the reality of command on June 6, 1944. Eisenhower was not standing on the brink of history with certainty. He was standing there with acceptance. Acceptance that the invasion could fail. Acceptance that lives would be lost regardless of outcome. Acceptance that responsibility could not be shared when decisions were his to make. That mindset did not weaken the Allied effort. It strengthened it. The Eisenhower D-Day speech prepared the world for defeat, but in doing so, it helped make victory possible. In the decades since World War II, the Eisenhower D-Day speech has endured not because of what it said, but because of what it represents. It stands as a rare, unfiltered glimpse into the private burden of command at the highest level. Most wartime leaders are remembered through victories, proclamations, and carefully managed public images. Eisenhower's unpublished statement cuts through all of that. It reveals a commander who understood that authority is meaningless without accountability, and that the true test of leadership comes before outcomes are known. By preparing to accept blame in advance, Eisenhower removed ego from the equation. He did not assume history would be kind. He prepared for the possibility that it would not be. That willingness to confront failure honestly is what separates calculated leadership from blind confidence. D-Day is often remembered as inevitable in hindsight, but the speech reminds us that it was anything but inevitable in reality. The document also reframes how we understand courage in modern warfare. Courage is often portrayed as decisiveness in action or fearlessness in battle. Eisenhower's courage was quieter. It lay in acknowledging uncertainty without allowing it to paralyze decision-making. He authorized the invasion knowing that tens of thousands might die and that failure could reshape the war for years. Writing the speech was not an act of doubt, but an act of moral clarity. It demonstrated that he understood the human cost of his decisions and was prepared to bear that cost personally. In doing so, he insulated his subordinates and preserved the cohesion of the Allied command structure. If disaster came, there would be no scramble to assign fault. The responsibility would stop with him. That clarity mattered in a coalition where mistrust and political fallout could have been as damaging as military defeat. What ultimately gives the Eisenhower D-Day speech its power is its absence from history's loudest moments. It was never broadcast. It never shaped public opinion. It never entered the emotional memory of the war in the way victory speeches did. Yet its existence shaped everything that followed. It allowed Eisenhower to lead through uncertainty without denial. It gave him the psychological space to wait, assess, and adapt as reports arrived from the beaches. When news from Omaha was grim, he did not panic. When the outcome was unclear, he did not retreat. He had already confronted the worst-case scenario and accepted it. That acceptance created stability at the top when instability was everywhere else. In the end, the Eisenhower D-Day speech that prepared the world for defeat tells us something uncomfortable but essential about how history is made. Victory is rarely the product of certainty. It is the result of decisions taken in full awareness of possible failure. D-Day succeeded not because leaders believed it could not fail, but because they were willing to proceed despite knowing that it might. Eisenhower's unused speech stands as proof that responsible leadership is not about predicting success, but about owning the consequences of decisions regardless of outcome. The beaches of Normandy became symbols of triumph, but behind that triumph was a commander who had already prepared himself for disaster. That preparation did not weaken the Allied cause, it strengthened it. And in that quiet readiness to accept defeat, Eisenhower revealed the kind of leadership that makes victory possible.